my invitation, and the president came with a crowded delegation in order to discuss certain issues. For instance, the situation beyond Euphrates River. Mr. Erdoğan and I discussed the goals of the military operation along the Syrian border. We discussed the steps that Turkey took in order to ensure its national security, and we understand these steps. With the rise of terrorism and certain ethnical conflicts, Turkey has increasing concerns which we share. We believe such conflicts have been artificially boosted recently, but what matters is that terror groups should not benefit from the military operation that Turkey is carrying. For instance, Daesh, they are in prisons and they attempt escape. For a long-lasting peace and stability in Syria, the territorial integrity and sovereignty of the country must be respected. This is our principle, and this is the context in which we discuss with the Turkish side. It's important that they share this position. The peace and stability in the region will be ensured by the Turks and Syrians, and this could not be possible without mutual respect between the two sides. A dialogue must be initiated with Kurds living in northeast of Syria. Only through such extensive dialogue, the Kurds, as an important element of Syrian people, their rights can be defended and protected. Of course, we have discussed some steps we would like to take. Syrians have a constitutional committee in which they will take some steps. The Astana process's guarantor states for a few years now have worked on the establishment of this constitutional committee. The work in the field must not prevent the works of the Constitutional Committee. On 29th and 30th of October, the committee will meet for the first time in Geneva. We also discussed humanitarian aid. Syrian refugees must return to their homeland as soon as possible, and countries which have accepted Syrians, including Turkey, are shouldering an important social and economic burden which will be lifted considerably with the return of refugees. When it comes to the return of Syrian refugees, we expect the support of organizations like the UN without any prerequisites or other conditions. They must offer this support, and by making use of this opportunity, we also had a chance to discuss our mutual cooperation. Our trade volume is on the rise. It has increased by 16% and has reached $25.5 billion. We have a plan to an agreement between governments, which was signed at the beginning of October, about accepting payment in local currencies. The Russian and Turkish currencies will be used in mutual trade, but also the Russian Mir card will be more widely used in the Turkish market, and Turkish banks and companies will establish connection with the Russian banks. Our cooperation in tourism, as well as our cooperation in some other industries, was also the topic of our discussions. Our cooperation in, for instance, in technical or military areas is improving. We have mutual years of culture and tourism. Finally, I would like to thank the Turkish President and my colleagues for this sincere talks. Our cooperation hopefully will increase and improve in various areas based on a principle of mutual respect and good neighborly relations. I'm also pleased that after a long work, we made certain decisions. Our ministers of foreign affairs will voice those decisions. This is a significant decision which could be a turning point about the situation on the border between the two countries. Esteemed members of the press, I'd like to greet you cordially as I begin my remarks. I'm pleased to be in Russia. As I begin my remarks, I'd like to commemorate a person who worked in the construction of the Akkuyu power plant, who lost their lives on Saturday in a tragic traffic accident. I'd like to start by offering my condolences. Also, the same day, a dam collapsed and 15 Russian citizens lost their lives. I also offer my condolences. Esteemed members of the press, in today's talks, our main topic on the agenda was the developments in Syria. We also had a chance to discuss our bilateral relations in great detail. In economy, as Mr. Putin just said, we discussed the increase of trade in local or national currencies. The agreements pertaining to this has recently been signed, as you're aware. This will help us in reaching our trade target of $100 billion. The Akkuyu nuclear power plant and the Turk Stream projects are two projects where we continue cooperating. We also stick to the timeline that we have decided on in the delivery of S-400 systems. In the future, based on our mutual interests, we will decisively maintain these important projects. As I raise this topic, we have also taken important steps and will continue doing so in the defense industry. With Mr. Putin, we discussed the peace and stability of Syria at a bilateral level and within the Astana process. We have worked a lot together. As a result of our joint efforts, the Sochi agreement and many other significant decisions have been taken. With the Constitutional Summit, we have declared the establishment of a Constitutional Committee. The committee will meet soon for the first time. Our expectation is that the Constitutional Committee will work in line with the legitimate expectations of Syrians and will pave the way for a real and comprehensive change. We also discussed the escalation of the tension around Idlib. At the current level of development, a relative peace has been established in Idlib and there has been a decrease achieved in attacks, which is pleasing. Our main goal in the process to follow is to maintain this environment of stability and to make it permanent. As Turkey, we understand the elimination of concerns of our Russian colleagues and the maintenance of stability in the region and will work for these ends.
ağırlıklı olarak
With the
Barış Pınarı Harekatımız
President, we
bağlamındaki
discussed
son
the
gelişmeleri
recent
ele aldık.
developments within our Peace
Sayın
Spring
Putin'e
operation.
harekatımız hakkında
We gave
kapsamlı bilgi verdik.
detailed information to Mr. Putin about our operation. As I have previously expressed, the main goal of the operation is to expel the PKK-YPG terror group from the region and to enable the return of Syrian refugees. This would also eliminate the threat of the dividing terror group and to guarantee the territorial unity of Syria. We had never any considerations for the territory or the sovereignty of the country. Every step we have taken in the field, we took with great care. With the Euphrates Shield and Olive Branch operation, we were able to cleanse a wide area from terrorists. The region that we have rendered safe was an area that 365,000 refugees returned voluntarily. Syria was in the past remembered by terror, but thanks to the efforts of Turkey, now Syrian land has peace and stability once again. We want to spread this to some other regions in the north of Syria. We have hosted 3.6 million Syrian brothers and sisters in the past few years, 350,000 of which are Kurdish. We must now take steps to ensure their return to their homeland. Another significant goal of the Peace Spring operation is to make this possible.
Harekatla güvenli hale getireceğimiz alana öncelikle
the area that we render safe, thanks to the operation, will be able to receive 1 million Syrians initially and another 1 million over time. We have shared our plans with our counterparts. With the contribution and support of the international community, hopefully we'll be able to put this plan into practice. We'll work with our Russian friends and we'll carry out projects which will facilitate voluntary returns. We discussed the fight against terror, the territorial integrity of Syria, and the political unity, and the return of refugees. We have reached a historic agreement. According to our agreements, Turkey and Russia will not allow any division on Syrian territory. Within 150 hours, YPG terrorists and their weapons will be taken out of the 30-kilometer wide zone and their fortifications and infrastructure will be destroyed. By the end of 150 hours, in the west and east of the Peace Spring operation area, there will be a 10-kilometer deep Russian and Turkish patrols. At Tel Frat and Manbij, all YPG terrorists will be pushed out of this zone together with their weapons. Against terrorist infiltrations, the two countries will take necessary measures, and for the following and monitoring of the memorandum, a joint mechanism will be established. Turkey and Russia will maintain their efforts for a solution to the crisis in Syria. We have reached an agreement with my dear friend Putin, which will be helpful for the permanent stability and its eradication from terror, and it will start a new period. I hope our memorandum will be auspicious for our two countries and our brothers and sisters in Syria. We are a neighbor to Syria and a friend to its people. So peace, stability, and security in this country, we want these to prevail once again in this country and will continue making efforts for this goal. I would like to thank Mr. Putin for his hospitality, and I thank you for your attention.
You're watching TRT World, and now Sergei Lavrov, Foreign Minister of Russia, and Mevlut Cavusoglu, Foreign Minister of Turkey, have come to the microphone. I don't know if we want to hear what these gentlemen... Yes, we do want to hear what they have to say, so let's first have a listen to Lavrov.
The President of Russian Federation and the President of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdoğan, and Vladimir Putin will continue the political integrity, and they will provide national security in Turkey. Number two, they underline their decisions to fight terrorism in all its forms, and they will fight separatism on the territory of Syria. Three, within this context, the existing status quo in the peace spring with a depth up to 30 kilometers will be kept. Number four, both countries underline the importance of Adnan agreement, and they will keep applying that. Five, starting from 12:00, 23 October 2019, on the Syrian side of Turkish-Syrian border, the Russian police forces will enter the territory, and they will support during the actions around the 30 kilometers of the border. Starting from this moment, they will start joint monitoring from Turkish and Russian side from the territory of Peace Spring. 6. All the troops will be withdrawn. 7. Both sides will take necessary measures to fight terrorism. And 8. They will help refugees to return in a peaceful way. 9. They will create a monitoring and verification mechanism to monitor and coordinate this memorandum. 10. Both sides will continue working on the solutions and mechanisms of solutions of Syrian conflict, and will keep up working with the Constitutional Committee. Thank you very much.
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan and Russian Head of State Mr. Vladimir Putin have agreed on the topics underlined below. 1. The two sides have agreed on the protection of the territorial integrity of Syria and the protection of the national security of Turkey. 2. Terrorism with its all shapes and forms will be fought against, and the division efforts in Syria must be fought against. 3. At Tel Abyad and Ras Al Ain, a 32-kilometer deep peace spring operation status will be preserved. 4. The two sides underline the significance of the Adana Agreement. Russia facilitates the application of the Adana Agreement. 5. By 23rd of October 2019, Russian military police and Syrian border guard will operate in the Syrian side of the Turkey-Syria border outside the Peace Spring operation zone. They will remove to the 30 kilometer outside the zone. This will be completed within 150 hours, and by the same time, the current Peace Spring operation zones east and west, 10 kilometer deep, excluding Kamışlı, Turkish-Russian joint patrols will begin. 6. from Manbij and Tel Rifat, all YPG elements will be removed together with their weapons. 7. Both parties will try and prevent the infiltration of terrorist elements and will take necessary measures. 8. For a safe and voluntary return of refugees, a joint work will begin. 9. In order to follow and coordinate the application of this memorandum, a verification mechanism will be established. 10. In line with the Astana mechanism, the parties will, in order to find a permanent solution to the Syrian crisis, will maintain their work, and the Constitutional Committee's work will be supported.
Okay, now you've heard from the foreign ministers of the two countries, and they're the presidents of the two nations, Russia and Turkey. This after about 5 to 6 hours of direct conversations between these four men in the Russian city of Sochi. And only in the last 10 minutes of that news conference did we get the details that we were waiting for, because it seems as if Turkey and Russia have come to a joint agreement about patrolling the 32-kilometer deep safe zone that Turkey has been demanding be created from the line that is its border with Syria, deep 32 kilometers into Syrian territory. So what we have is President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan saying that in a 150-hour period, there are going to be Turkish and Russian patrols which are going to push YPG terrorists out of certain areas of northeastern Syria, and that a joint mechanism between the two countries is going to be established. Then Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, confirming that it will be Russian military police who are going to provide and engage in joint monitoring with Turkish troops. What at the moment is a little bit unclear from the translation that I was hearing along with you is whether Turkish troops are going to remain inside Turkish territory or whether the joint mechanism will also see them periodically and in certain areas of Syria entering Syrian territory. Also importantly, that the safe zone status is going to be preserved. That, of course, one of Turkey's biggest demands and one of the main aims of Operation Peace Spring, which now has just about 2 hours to go. Just under 2 hours from now, Operation Peace Spring and the 120-hour, 5-day pause that had been agreed between Turkey and the United States, that pause will expire. Recep Tayyip Erdoğan saying, even before he left for Sochi, that if the Americans do not stick to their side of the agreement and make sure and facilitate, as the Americans have promised, the withdrawal of YPG terrorists from that safe zone, that Turkey will resume Operation Peace Spring. It seems here that there's a separate agreement, along with the one made with the Americans, here with Russia, that will be possibly even longer lasting because of Russian influence in Syria and Moscow being the biggest international backer of the regime of Bashar al-Assad. Okay, those are just some of the top points that have come out of this news conference. Let's go to Sochi and speak to our correspondent, Hassan Abdullah. Hassan, how significant was it that actually Vladimir Putin, who spoke first as the host of this bilateral meeting, he gave no indication at all of what was to come, and then towards the end of Recep Tayyip Erdoğan's speech, we got to the nub of the matter about how the safe zone is going to be policed by Turkish troops and Russian troops, and then we got even more details from the foreign ministers.
That's right, Adnan. It's quite interesting, actually, because the way the two presidents started, they very briefly talked about the Syria situation, the usual stuff about protecting the territorial integrity of Syria, and then they started talking about trade. Initially, it gave the impression that perhaps there was no breakthrough, there was nothing substantial coming out of that. Now that they had started talking about their bilateral trade going up to $25 billion and so forth. But then suddenly comes this bombshell, as some may want to call it. They talked about agreement on a joint patrol mechanism between Turkish and Russian security, and the guarantees that Turkey had been seeking that the YPG terrorist organization will be expelled from the area. They also talked about the preservation of the status quo. Now, I understand that from the Turkish side, this would probably be interpreted as preserving the safe zone with the parameters that Turkey has been calling for. That's going to be 32 kilometers deep and about 444 kilometers long, extending all the way to northeastern Syria. And then there was, of course, the interesting point about the expulsion of YPG along with its weapons from Manbij. This has been one of the sticking points, one of the contentious issues even between Turkey and the United States. Turkey is often referred to this Manbij deal collapsing, the US not fulfilling its side of the commitment. So it seems from what we've heard so far that the Turkish concern on Manbij may just have been addressed and the YPG would be expelled from that area. Now, obviously, there is some nitty-gritty that would perhaps become clearer later on as to when this joint mechanism, as it's implemented, what's going to be the status of Bashar al-Assad and his forces moving in or so. That's not entirely clear at this point in time. They also talked, Adnan, about the Adana agreement. Again, this is something Turkey has been calling for. Turkey has been saying that since 2011, the Assad regime has been violating the Adana agreement that basically sought assurance from Syria that it would not allow the PKK terrorist organization or other affiliated groups to use Syrian soil to target Turkey. We heard emphasis from Russia that this agreement is going to be observed.
Okay, so we lost Hassan Abdullah there, who's speaking to us from Sochi. But just to repeat one of the top lines that has come out actually from Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, who is just to the side of the two leaders, Vladimir Putin and President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Sergei Lavrov saying the Russian military police and Syrian border guards are going to be deployed on the Syrian side of the border with Turkey, and that will start at midnight, October the 30th, outside of the zone of the Turkish military operation. So these are bits and pieces that have been confirmed by the four men in that room in Sochi, that these joint patrols in northern Syria are going to happen. And you can see possibly on one of the straps at the bottom of your screen, Recep Tayyip Erdogan saying that they will be 10 kilometers in depth into Syrian territory. But we really, really need the detail 100% confirmed to understand whether Turkish troops are going to be permanently or temporarily, but at any point in time inside Syrian territory. It's important to note that despite there being fears in the international community that Syria's territorial integrity has been compromised by Turkey's Operation Peace Spring, every time any representative of Recep Tayyip Erdogan's government speaks, or the president himself, there is the repetition that Turkey has no long-term claims on any Syrian territory, that the aims of Operation Peace Spring are to clear the area of YPG terrorists, which clearly Vladimir Putin has understood. He even started by saying, we've been discussing, Recep Tayyip Erdogan and I, the steps that Turkey has taken to ensure its national security. In other words, Operation Peace Spring, which we, Russia, understand and share. He said that the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Syria must be respected for longer-term stability, something that Turkey has always agreed with, and both men stressing that the political process now is well underway. One of the most important sticking points in the entire political process in terms of finding some sort of longer-term resolution to the war in Syria, which is now in its 9th year, is the status of the constitution. The constitution practically guarantees Bashar al-Assad's Ba'ath Party permanent leadership because it makes the Ba'ath Party the protector of the state. The constitution is going to be rewritten. Both leaders saying that it will be rewritten in a way that reflects the requirements of Syrians. Vladimir Putin saying on the 29th and 30th of this month in Geneva, that committee is going to meet formally for the very first time. Let's speak to TRT World's Obeda Hito, who is in Akçakale near the Turkey-Syria border. While we're listening to all of this, Obeda, going on in Sochi, we're also keeping one eye on the clock. It's now almost 20 past 5 GMT, and at 1900, at 7 o'clock p.m. GMT, the pause, the 5-day pause of Operation Peace Spring is going to end. Whatever's coming out of Sochi, I'm trying to understand how that relates to Operation Peace Spring and the threat from Recep Tayyip Erdoğan that the military operation will resume if YPG terrorists have not pulled back from the safe zone.
Well, as the clock runs down on the 120-hour pause to the operation, it seems that Russia has managed to buy 150 more hours. Russia has now guaranteed Turkey that the YPG would be removed from all of the border area from the city of Jarablos all the way to the Iraqi border, with the exception of Qamishli. How this is going to work is going to be very interesting. In Manbij, for example, there are definitely civilians still living there, but they may not be willing to live under Assad regime control or even Russian oversight. In other areas along the border, people may not be willing to accept the presence of regime troops or not. So it will be interesting to see how the locals in these areas are going to react. Now, what I understood from the announcement was that the areas that Turkey has already entered, from Ras Al Ain to Tel Abyad, will remain under Turkish-backed Syrian National Army control, and the Turkish military will remain in those positions. And then on the east and west of that particular area, about 120 kilometers wide and 30 kilometers deep, on the east and west of that is where the joint patrols between Turkey and Russia are going to take place, about 10 kilometers deep into Syrian territory, where the YPG will be pushed out. This also includes, according to the agreement that we've heard, an area that is stuck in northwest Halab, in northwest Aleppo, called Tel Rifat. This is an area where the YPG remains, where the YPG has positions, actual military positions. They continued over the last several months to conduct attacks on Afrin, on Azaz, launching mortars and artillery attacks. Now, according to this agreement, the Russian military police and the regime are going to be moving into Tel Rifat and pushing the YPG out. How all of this is going to play out over the next 150 hours is going to be very interesting. We've heard from many YPG commanders that they are not engaged in any talks with the Russians or the regime, and that they are not willing to agree to any kind of arrangement with Russia or the regime. Some of those YPG commanders have even said that they reject any conditions that would force them to move away from the Turkey-Syria border. So the Americans, as far as we can tell, have not been able to meet Turkey's demands so far to pull the YPG away from the border. Now Russia is going to get a chance to fulfill Turkey's demands to pull the YPG away from the border. We have 150 hours now to watch the situation on the ground, to see whether Turkey can work with Russia and the Assad regime to pull the YPG away from the border. And people on the ground, the Syrian National Army, the Turkish military, is going to be anxiously watching how this develops over the next few days.
Obeyda, stay there. I just want to repeat something for the benefit of the viewers. So one of the news agencies here, if I just check, is Reuters. And I was telling you about this particularly pertinent fact that came out of the mouth of Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. And this is repeated here in the memorandum of understanding that I have that has come to us from Russia. So this is the memorandum of understanding, and whether it's a translation problem or not, it's only a matter of 12 hours. But there's a bit of confusion between Reuters and between the memorandum itself, which says, point 5, being starting at 12 noon on October the 23rd, Reuters has said it would be midnight October the 23rd. But the point is the rest of the substance in point 5. It says, at that moment, Russian military police and Syrian border guards will enter the Syrian side of the Turkish-Syrian border, outside the area of Operation Peace Spring. It will facilitate the removal of YPG elements and their weapons to a depth of 30 kilometers from the Turkish-Syrian border, which should be finalized, as Obeyda was telling you, in 150 hours. At that moment, joint Russian-Turkish patrols will start in the west and the east of the area of Operation Peace Spring, with a depth of 10 kilometers, except Kamishli city. Okay, Obeyda, that means that Turkish units of the military are going to be inside Syrian territory. Both men, clearly, Presidents Erdoğan and Putin, have understood that the overall integrity, the territorial integrity of Syria should not suffer in the longer term. So this is clearly, they didn't make it totally clear, but this is obviously going to be a temporary measure. Turkey has insisted that Operation Peace Spring will only be a temporary measure. We presume that the Russians think the same thing if they're going to be patrolling the safe zone. Turkey seems to have got what it wanted because both Vladimir Putin and Recep Tayyip Erdoğan, they again repeated that the purpose of this safe zone not only is border security for Turkey, but eventually both countries are going to build infrastructure in that area to facilitate the voluntary repatriation of Syrian refugees who are living in Turkey.
Well, the situation in northeast Syria has been quite problematic for Turkey. The issue that Turkey wants to make sure gets resolved is that any threat from the YPG terror group is neutralized. The YPG terror group is the Syrian wing of the PKK terror group that's recognized by the EU, by the US, by Turkey as a terror group. This group has received support from the United States over the last several years. That support includes training, advanced military technology, military vehicles, ammunition, heavy artillery, different kinds of weaponry. This all poses a threat to Turkish national security. Now, Turkey was patient with the United States for many years, telling the United States that you are doing something wrong, that fighting one terror group by supporting another terror group is a bad policy, asking the United States to stop this policy, but they refuse to do so, the United States. So now Turkey is asking Russia, Turkey has allowed Russia to step up to fill in the space that America has left behind. America has pulled out its troops from northeast Syria. So there is a huge vacuum left behind now by the absence of U.S. troops. Now Russia and the regime are going to try and fill in that gap. There are some issues that might come up. There have been reports over the last several days that YPG troops that were in position near the border area simply changed the outfits that they were wearing, and instead of wearing YPG regalia, they were putting on regime regalia and putting up Russian and regime flags. So this is going to be a logistical challenge over the next several days for Turkey to make sure that the troops that are actually positioned near the Turkey-Syria border are, in fact, military police sent by Russia and Syrian regime troops. The other issue that's going to come up here is whether or not the locals in these areas are going to accept the presence of regime and Russian troops. The regime and Russia have been bombing Syrians, have been killing Syrians, have been jailing Syrians, and this is something that the Syrians have rejected any kind of role for Assad or even Russia in the future of Syria. Now, Turkey and Russia on a diplomatic level have been working very hard to ensure that a political solution to the Syrian conflict goes forward. That's why we heard all of the gentlemen who spoke today in Sochi insisting that the work of the Constitutional Committee should not be hindered by the operation and should not be hindered by the joint Turkey-Russia efforts, and that the Constitutional Committee is key to making sure that a political transition goes forward in Syria, not just in northeast Syria, but in all of Syria. And they also mentioned that they want to have some kind of mechanism to monitor the situation and to allow for Syrians to return home, to voluntarily go back to their lands. President Erdoğan mentioned that there were 350,000 Syrian Kurds who were displaced from northeast Syria. He would like to see them go back to their land in northeast Syria. But most of those Kurds who left northeast Syria left because of oppression by the YPG terror group. If the YPG terror group is out of these border areas, then the assumption is that these people may return to their homes, and this is what they're working towards. And everyone, I'm sure now, after this announcement, is anxiously waiting to see how effective this is going to be after the Turkish-American efforts or the American efforts to pull the YPG away from the border have failed, and Turkey has now turned to Russia to see how Russia could facilitate this instead.
Obeyda, thank you so much. Obeyda Hito, our correspondent on the Turkey-Syria border. Let's go to Washington and speak to our correspondent there, Sally Ahan. Obeyda's hinted at it. In fact, he's made it pretty clear that with the Americans gone from northeastern Syria, Turkey is turning to Russia to guarantee its border security. This is a big blow for American foreign policy in the Middle East overall, Sally, it seems.
Yes, it certainly is, but perhaps one that is not to be expected. I mean, as far as Donald Trump's concerned, when he decided to make the decision to withdraw troops out of the US, he just simply wanted to bring the troops home and to make sure that the US was not going to be in this war, or in this conflict. So this is, of course, a situation that Donald Trump was very confident to leave in the hands of President Erdoğan and also Putin.
Yes, I mean, Donald Trump has said there's a lot of sand over there, let them fight their own wars, it's not the US's problem. But at the end of the day, whatever his base thinks, and those people in the Midwest or wherever they may be who don't even leave their own state, apparently most Americans don't even leave their own state, let alone leave their own country. There are going to be politicians in Congress who are going to say, this is your fault, Mr. President, you set all of this in motion. Turkey is one thing. We can talk about Turkey's international relations with other countries, with our other correspondents, but you there in Washington, are you not convinced that over the next few days, you are going to hear increasing criticism of what Donald Trump is doing in the Middle East and especially in Syria these days?
Absolutely, and it's something that we've been hearing all along ever since he made this decision to pull troops out of Syria. He's had bipartisan pushback. We've had a lot of strong Republican support for troops staying in Turkey. So this is something that Donald Trump has been trying to step backwards, trying to get Republicans back on side, but without trying to renege on his policy that he's been trying to push through his 2016 campaign, that he wants to tick another box and prove to his base that he can achieve the things that he said he would. As far as President Donald Trump is concerned, he's only concerned about his public message and how in which his viewers or his voters are taking his policies. He's only concerned about what Republicans and certainly what Democrats think, as long as his message and his PR, so to speak, isn't being disrupted on the airwaves. So for Donald Trump, he perhaps sees this as a success, and it's certainly the way in which he's talking about it.
Sally, in terms of the White House's overall Middle Eastern policies, has there been any reaction so far from state or from defense or from the White House? After a few hours ago, the Iraqis saying that these troops that the White House wants to send from northeastern Syria to western Iraq to counter any potential rise of Daesh, that they don't want them. They don't want the American troops in their country.
Well, there's certainly been a lot of sort of contrast in the way that the White House and the State Department has reflected on these comments. Of course, Donald Trump has been campaigning for bringing the US troops home, yet this is not exactly what was going to happen. They were first going to go to Iraq and then potentially come home. And now Mark Esper, of course, has had to renege on that and say, well, OK, we are going to send those troops to Iraq, but then eventually they will come home. So continually we see this circle in which allies of Trump are trying to stick to their word, but also not contradict what President Donald Trump is saying too much.
OK, Sally, thank you very much indeed. Sally Ahan with the American angle there. But let's go back to Sochi, that Russian resort city, where this news has come through after about a 5-6 hour meeting between Presidents Putin and Erdoğan. The fact that Hassan Abdullah, our diplomatic correspondent, there are going to be joint Russian-Turkish patrols. They're going to start in the west and the east of the area of Operation Peace Spring. In other words, inside Syrian territory. So this is all designed, as it all began on the 9th of this month with the operation, Turkey wanting to remove YPG terrorists from anywhere close to its own border. Turkey seems to be, with every negotiation that it's having with the Americans or with the Russians, getting closer and closer to the full establishment of this safe zone.
That's right, Adnan. Interestingly, earlier this afternoon, I was talking to one Turkish official and I asked him what his expectations were. He was quite optimistic, and this is way before the meeting went over to like 6 hours or so that it went on for. And he said that the reason he believed the Turkish side would eventually succeed, as he put it, was because the narrative that Turkey had was strong. He said that there may be others who may be using hard power to push their agendas, but the Turkish narrative, he said, was strong. Now, I think the Turkish officials would probably say that if this 10-point agenda, if Russia lives up to its commitment in enforcing this 10-point joint declaration, then the Turkish objectives regarding Syria would probably be met. Let's look at those two objectives. The first was the national security of Turkey, eliminating the threat emanating from Syria, the very first point in this. Now, in the past meetings that we've attended, there's always been this mention of political unity and territorial integrity of Syria. But what they have emphasized this time is the national security of Turkey. It says the two sides reiterate their commitment to the protection of national security of Turkey. The second point in it talks about disrupting separatist agendas. Now, from Turkish point of view, there is no room for much interpretation here. The separatist agendas refers to the YPG seeking to carve out an area to the north of Syria. And then, of course, talking about the safe zone and joint patrolling there. So again, this is something that seems to cover the security concern of Turkey. And then it goes on to talk about the return of the refugees. This has been the second concern for Turkey, and of course, lasting political peace. The ninth point here talks about setting up a joint monitoring and verification mechanism to ensure that this memorandum is implemented. And then it talks about continuing the work within the Astana framework to bring lasting peace to Syria and to support the activity of the Constitutional Committee. Now, speaking of the Constitutional Committee, we heard from both leaders say that the Constitutional Committee is going to be meeting this month.
Hassan, how interesting is it to you that we have the presidents of Russia and Turkey talking about what's happening inside a third country? When I was watching that and taking notes when Vladimir Putin was speaking, every time he made a point, I got the impression that he was almost speaking on behalf of the Syrian regime. Is there any way that the Syrian regime is going to make any of this difficult, any of these agreements that we're talking about that have been discussed in Sochi?
Well, I think if we look at this memorandum, it's quite clear that the Syrian regime probably feels that it does stand to benefit as well. For example, when they talk about the Syrian security forces moving in along with the Russians to patrol an area from where both will jointly eject the YPG. The Assad regime probably feels that it does it will probably manage to consolidate some territory. Remember, the Syrian regime on its own does not have the capacity to do that. It hasn't been able to eject even Daesh from many of the areas. It hasn't been able to eject many of the opposition groups in areas they have been fighting, and the tides only turned after the Russian bombing started. So perhaps the Syrian regime here feels that it does stand to gain something. From a Turkish point of view, it's quite clear. The Turkish position has been that the Assad regime has not had the legitimacy from its people. It has killed 500,000 of its own people, and had it not been for its external backers, it probably would have collapsed a long time ago.
Hassan, thank you very much indeed. Hassan Abdullah, our diplomatic correspondent in Sochi. Okay, our Turkey analyst Yusuf Erim is here. Yusuf, I know you have the map that we've been showing for the past month or so about that safe zone. But first of all, how surprised are you at what's been announced in Sochi?
Not surprised at all. I mean, it was a 6-hour Sochi marathon, and I was expecting a big deal to come out of it. Such detailed discussions always end up with a huge announcement, especially when you have two pragmatic leaders who are solution-oriented, like Erdoğan and Putin, working together. And it's exactly what I expected. Both sides got a lot of what they wanted. Both sides had to make some compromises to make the other happy. And it's exactly what you expect when you have two important partners working together to try to create stability in Syria and hopefully bring back refugees with a voluntary return. Also, there's a very delicate situation right now in the northeast with Operation Peace Spring on halt right now. So it seems like a good deal for both sides. Like I said, not everything that they wanted, but enough to make both sides happy.
Okay, geographically, what are the most important points that we need to bear in mind?
Okay, let's get right into it now. Between Tel Abyad and Ras Al Ain, this is the area of Operation Peace Spring. Right here, you can see they're both bordered in black. This is the operation of area of Peace Spring operation, and right now, this area will have the status quo. The way it is right now, up to 32 kilometers deep, Turkish troops will remain there, and that's it. They will be controlling that area. Now, when we go outside of the area, continued Operation Peace Spring area, you can see it outlined with the yellow and blue diagonal lines. Now, in those areas, let me see, I'm still catching up. I'm still catching up myself. Everything's brand new now. Starting at 12 noon on October 23rd, Russian military police and Syrian border guards will enter the Syrian side of the Turkish border outside of this area. I want to show you once again, this area right here till Ras Al Ain, outside of that area, but within the black border that's still in the blue and yellow diagonal lines, they're going to facilitate the removal of YPG elements and their weapons to a depth of 30 kilometers. So a depth of 30 kilometers is that black border again, the M4 highway. And they're going to have 150 hours to do this. They're going to have 150 hours to remove all YPG elements from the area that Turkey calls the safe zone. And at that moment, joint Russian and Turkish patrols will start east to west outside of, again, the operation area that I was telling you about, this Tel Abyad to Ras Al Ain area. Outside of that area, with a depth of 10 kilometers, except for Kamishli. Now, we don't have Kamishli, but Kamishli is all the way towards the Iraqi-Syria border, towards the right side of the map, and outside of that area. Now, Kamishli is an area that was very important to the regime. They actually had a liaison office there since the beginning of the Syrian conflict, so I can see why Kamishli was taking it out of this part of the agreement.
Okay, listen, can I just, let me confirm this again, and I don't want to move too far out of the light. So there in the west, that area which has got lines across it, and this area here to the east, we're talking about Russian and Turkish patrols in those two areas.
There's going to be Russian and Syrian border patrol, border guard patrols for 150 hours. And then after the 150 hours, once they've expelled the YPG elements from that region, then there's going to be a joint Russian-Turkish patrol up to 10 kilometers deep.
Into Syrian territory.
Into Syrian territory, yes. Now, another important point. Right here we have Manbij. This is, now we're moving west of the Euphrates River. And also we have Tel Rifat right here, also the yellow patch we see above Aleppo. Now, both of these areas, they will have YPG elements completely removed from it. This is very important because Manbij has been a very strategic part of the safe zone. Turkey wanted to incorporate it. Turkey had worked a year and a half ago with the U.S. on Manbij. They actually constructed a roadmap together with their U.S. partners, but it was never implemented properly. It was supposed to be completed in 90 days, and we're still talking about it 18 months later. So hopefully the U.S.-Turkey partnership, the Russian-Turkey partnership will be more successful in their version of a Manbij roadmap. And well, that remains to be seen. We will have to see how that's going to happen. And also they talked about both sides reaffirming the importance of the Adana Agreement. This is an agreement where the Syrian regime recognizes the PKK as a terrorist group, where the Syrian regime also guarantees that there will not be threats emanating from the Syrian side across to the Turkish border from the PKK or its affiliates. And in the event that the Syrian regime cannot stop these threats, Turkey has the right to cross into the border. This was also the pretense that Turkey used to legally enter areas like Tel Abyad and Ras Al Ain. So they're confirming that this is continuing, that this has been certified, and will continue the Adana Agreement as is, no revisions to it right now.
Why do you think they've put this 150-hour timetable on it? That essentially means at some stage on October the 29th, that time will have expired. Why not give yourself a bit more time to remove YPG terrorists from the area? Do it slowly, methodically, carefully, and don't give yourself a timetable. Just get it done.
Well, Turkey has had very bad experiences with very long timetables with the Americans, and they've learned their lesson to keep that time frame short. to keep the level of implementation professional, serious, and rapid. And it's worked so far between Tel Aviv and Ras Al Ain. It looks like the pause with the Americans is working. It looks like may continue. We've seen comments coming out of the U.S. We've seen comments coming out of Turkey. Even though it's fragile and there have been 40 some odd violations, nothing major that we see so far to result in a decertification of this pause. So that remains to be seen. We're only about an hour and a half away from the deadline for that pause. So I'm sure we're going to be getting comments in the later half of the night. If this halt is going to turn into a complete conclusion. We've seen comments come out of the U.S. that if Turkey concludes this operation, all sanctions will be lifted. So there's a lot going on right now in the Russia-Turkey-U.S. triangle.
Okay, so let's just pick up on what do you think the American interpretation may be of this deal? Might they think, actually, as far as they're concerned, it's kind of a continuation of Operation Peace Spring because it still sees Turkish troops inside Syrian territory? They could easily see it that way.
Exactly. They do see it that way, I believe, and they should see it that way because Turkey has not left the safe zone that was agreed upon with the Americans. They're still operating inside that zone. But as we had previously spoken here, to have the diplomacy on the table with the Americans trickle down into the field, you also need to deal with the Russians as well, because when it comes to boots on the ground and control over the regime, that's where Russian presence and Russian diplomacy is important. President Erdoğan had a quick flight to Sochi, and he was able to strike this deal. Like I say, is it exactly what the Turks wanted? No, but it's a lot of what they wanted. It's easing the country's national security concerns. Is this what the Russians wanted? No, but it's also easing many of their concerns, and it looks like a good compromise for both sides right now.
Yusuf, really appreciate it. Thanks very much indeed for the moment. We're going to speak to Deniz Kultuk, who's a military analyst. He joins us from Sochi with more on this story. Deniz, how do you feel about this agreement?
Not from Sochi, I am from Ankara. I think it's been a long afternoon for those who have worked hard in Sochi. But after all, that signed memorandum of understanding reflects the truly statement has prevailed this afternoon. I think it's a win-win situation for both Turks and Russians, and also for Syrians. And no one's interest has been put at stake. And the Russians has got the gist of the issue, which was the Turkish security concern over cross-border attacks coming from YPG and PKK. That formulation of this 10 items memorandum of understanding has got more than 7 operational lines on it, which ensures the persistent concerns of both sides. It's a great success from my understanding.
What problems do you see these joint patrols encountering? What are the things that they most need to look out for, the two sides, when they're operating inside northeastern Syria?
Of course, they will check out the remnants of YPG or PKK or any groups like that to make sure that they wouldn't harm for the interest of neither Turkey nor Syria. And that needs to be done, and it has been done in a practical way, as I understand. And their weapons will be removed based on the item 6. And Turkey has a long border, as you know, between Turkey and Syria. We have a 900 kilometers long border. And the deal was concluded with the United States, about 120 kilometers of it, 120 kilometers of it. And the west of that part was needed to be addressed, and today it's been addressed. And east part of this 120 kilometers needed to be addressed. I think this has been addressed, apart from Kamışlı, which was caveated this time. I think they are going to look after Kamışlı issue later on.
Deniz, where do you think the YPG are going to go? I mean, where have they been going? Does anybody know that? Does the intelligence, is it in the public sphere since the 9th of October when Turkey launched Operation Peace Spring? Where have the YPG terrorists who have not either surrendered or been killed. Where have they been going? Where might they go once Russia tries to drive them out?
Their rational course must be closer to Syrian state's forces. They should come to a conclusion with their long-term relationship with Syrian army, and they should either be embraced by Syrian army or to be put into jail by Syrians. They have nowhere other than this to go. Therefore, that is to be effectively eliminated at the end of the day.
And then, on October the 29th, when the 150 hours expire, the time limit that the Russians and Turkey have given themselves, what do you expect to happen then? It's not going to be a brand new dawn. Nothing is going to have changed apart from the fact that the YPG won't be in that area. But will the threat still remain of possible attacks coming from outside the safe zone? And what happens in terms of the infrastructure of the area, the desire for Turkey, which has been confirmed by Russia as well, the destruction of all YPG infrastructure, all of that? That's just another moment in a long, long timetable, isn't it?
When forces are on field, I think those 10 kilometers cannot be easily violated by any insurgents. And if that happens, and there will be counterattacks, eliminating those kind of actions, 10-kilometer borderline security is good enough for the border that long. But those areas will be deserted by YPG, as I expect. And then after, the security and safety will be ensured by Turkish and Russian troops guarding the region. I don't see any difficulty there. I think this is straightforward and in the simplest form of a planning. The problem is whether this plan will be fully implemented or not. If not, they will understand that it has some flaw on it. Those flaws then to be addressed by the joint monitoring and verification mechanism established on the basis of 9th item of this MOU. Therefore, they will take necessary care of it.
Dennis, wait there for one moment, if you don't mind. We just want to show the viewers something that the communications director for the Republic of Turkey has just tweeted. He's Fahrettin Altun, and then we'll come back to you, Dennis. So here's what Mr. Altun has said. Today's agreement between Turkey and Russia marks the beginning of a new era in our bilateral relations. This is a great day for civilized nations fighting against terrorist groups. Syria's territorial integrity and political unity are key to a stable future in the region. Deniz Kutluk is with us, military analyst speaking to us from Ankara. Deniz, in terms of the political process, in terms of the territorial integrity of Syria, is this now a safe zone there along the border with Turkey, something that will be managed by the Syrian regime eventually once Turkey gets all of the security that it's long desired?
That is my understanding and expectation. I concur with Mr. Fahrettin's statement as well. That's a remarkable achievement, what was discussed and concluded today. I think that has ensured everyone's concern and that hasn't put into risk anyone's interest. That is a very balanced arrangement, as I understand.
That is really appreciated. Thank you so much indeed. Deniz Kutluk. Oh, yeah, go on, yeah.
Last but not least, I think that conclusion of this meeting has been much more easier than the meeting which was held with our big allies last week.
Thank you so much, Deniz. Really appreciate it. Deniz Kutluk speaking to us from Ankara. OK, so as we were explaining to you, if you were with us at the start of that news conference in Sochi, it was a little bit bizarre because President Vladimir Putin, as the host of the bilateral dialogue that was taking place there in that Russian resort city, he mentioned none of what was to come. In other words, the agreement that we're talking about joint patrols, about the Russian military police also being involved in pushing the YPG out of the border areas between Turkey and Syria. And it all fell down to President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan to give the details, which were then confirmed by his foreign minister, Mevlut Çavuşoğlu. So let's hear what Erdoğan had to say while standing next to Russia's President Vladimir Putin.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are grateful for being offered this opportunity. Recently, we had a phone call where I expressed my invitation, and the president came with a crowded delegation in order to discuss certain issues. For instance, the situation beyond Euphrates River. Mr. Erdoğan and I discussed the goals of the military operation along the Syrian border. We discussed the steps that Turkey took in order to ensure its national security, and we understand these steps. With the rise of terrorism and certain ethnical conflicts, Turkey has increasing concerns which we share. We believe such conflicts have been artificially boosted recently, but what matters is that terror groups should not benefit from the military operation that Turkey is carrying. For instance, Daesh, they are in prisons and they attempt escape. For a long-lasting peace and stability in Syria, the territorial integrity and sovereignty of the country must be respected. This is our principle, and this is the context in which we discuss with the Turkish side. It's important that they share this position. The peace and stability in the region will be ensured by the Turks and Syrians, and this could not be possible without mutual respect between the two sides. A dialogue must be initiated with Kurds living in northeast of Syria. Only through such extensive dialogue the Kurds, as an important element of Syrian people, their rights can be defended and protected. Of course, we have discussed some steps we would like to take. Syrians have a constitutional committee in which they will take some steps. The Astana processes guarantor states for a few years now have worked on the establishment of this constitutional committee. The work in the field must not prevent the works of the Constitutional Committee. On 29th and 30th of October, the committee will meet for the first time in Geneva. We also discussed humanitarian aid. Syrian refugees must return to their homeland as soon as possible, and countries which have accepted Syrians, including Turkey, are shouldering an important social and economic burden, which will be lifted considerably with the return of refugees. When it comes to the return of Syrian refugees, we expect the support of organizations like the UN. Without any prerequisites or other conditions, they must offer this support. And by making use of this opportunity, we also had a chance to discuss our mutual cooperation. Our trade volume is on the rise. It has increased by 16% and has reached $25.5 billion. We have a plan to an agreement between governments, which was signed at the beginning of October, about accepting payment in local currencies. The Russian and Turkish currencies will be used in mutual trade, but also the Russian Mir card will be more widely used in the Turkish market, and Turkish banks and companies will establish connection with the Russian banks. Our cooperation in tourism, as well as our cooperation in some other industries, was also the topic of our discussions. Our cooperation in, for instance, in technical or military areas is improving. We have mutual years of culture and tourism. Finally, I would like to thank the Turkish president and my colleagues for this sincere talks. Our cooperation hopefully will increase and improve in various areas based on a principle of mutual respect and good neighborly relations. I'm also pleased that after a long work, we made certain decisions. Our ministers of foreign affairs will voice those decisions. This is a significant decision which could be a turning point about the situation on the border between the two countries. Esteemed members of the press, I'd like to greet you cordially as I begin my remarks. I'm pleased to be in Russia. As I begin my remarks, I'd like to commemorate a person who worked in the construction of the Akkuyu power plant, who lost their lives on Saturday in a tragic traffic accident. I'd like to start by offering my condolences. Also, the same day, a dam collapsed and 15 Russian citizens lost their lives. I also offer my condolences. Esteemed members of the press, in today's talks, our main topic on the agenda was the developments in Syria. We also had a chance to discuss our bilateral relations in great detail. In economy, as Mr. Putin just said, we discussed the increase of trade in our national currencies. The agreement pertaining to this has recently been signed, as you're aware. This will help us in reaching our trade target of $100 billion. The Akkuyu nuclear power plant and the Turk Stream projects are two projects where we continue cooperating. We also stick to the timeline that we have decided on in the delivery of S-400 systems. In the future, based on our mutual interests, we will decisively maintain these important projects. As I raise this topic, we have also taken important steps and will continue doing so in the defense industry. With Mr. Putin, we discussed the peace and stability of Syria at a bilateral level and within the Astana process. We have worked a lot together. As a result of our joint efforts, the Sochi agreement and many other significant decisions have been taken. With the Constitutional Summit, we have declared the establishment of a Constitutional Committee. The committee will meet soon for the first time. Our expectation is that the Constitutional Committee will work in line with the legitimate expectations of Syrians and will pave the way for a real and comprehensive change. We also discussed the escalation of the tension around Idlib. At the current level of development, a relative peace has been established in Idlib, and there has been a decrease achieved in attacks, which is pleasing. Our main goal in the process to follow is to maintain this environment of stability and to make it permanent.
gerek Rus
As
dostlarımızın endişelerinin
Turkey, we
giderilmesi,
understand the elimination of concerns of our Russian colleagues and the maintenance of stability in the region, and will
değerli
work
arkadaşlar,
for
bugün
these
Sayın
ends.
Başkan'la ağırlıklı olarak
With the
Barış Pınarı Harekatımız
President, we
bağlamındaki
discussed
son gelişmeleri
the recent
ele aldık.
developments within our Peace
Sayın
Spring
Putin'e
operation.
harekatımız hakkında
We gave
kapsamlı bilgi verdik.
detailed information
Daha önce
to Mr.
ifade
Putin
ettiğim gibi,
about our
harekatın
operation.
ana gayesi
As I have previously
bölgeden
expressed, the main
PKK,
goal of
YPG
the
terör
operation
örgütünü
is
çıkartıp
to
Suriyeli
expel the
sığınmacıların
PKK
geri
YPG
dönüşünü
terror group from the
sağlamaktır.
region and to
Bu
enable
harekat aynı
the return
zamanda
of
bölücü terör
Syrian
tehdidini ortadan
refugees.
kaldırarak
This would also
Suriye'nin
eliminate the
toprak
threat
bütünlüğünü
of the
ve siyasi
dividing
birliğini de
terror group
garanti altına
and to
almaktadır.
guarantee
Bizim
the
hiçbir zaman
territorial unity of
Ülkenin
Syria.
toprağında, egemenliğinde
We had
gözümüz yok.
never any considerations
olarak
for the territory
şimdiye kadar
or
sahada
the
attığımız
sovereignty of
bütün
the
adımları
country.
hassasiyetle
Every step we have taken in the field, we
Fırat
took
Kalkanı
with
ve Zeytin
great
Dalı
care.
harekatlarıyla
With the
4000
Euphrates
kilometre
shields
karelik
and
alanı
olive branch
teröristlerden
operation,
temizledik.
we were able to cleanse
Ülkemizin
a
güvenli
wide
hale
area
getirdiği bölge,
from terrorists.
365 bin
The
Suriyeli
region that we have
olarak
rendered
geri
safe was an area that 365,000
terörle
refugees
çatışmalarla anılan
returned
Suriye
voluntarily. Syria
Türkiye'nin
was
çabaları
in the past
neticesinde
remembered
yıllar
by
sonra
terror,
yeniden
but thanks to the
huzura
efforts of
ve
Turkey,
istikrara
now
kavuştu.
Syrian land
modeli
has peace and
Suriye'nin
stability
kuzeyindeki diğer
once
yerlere
again.
de teşvik etmek
We
istiyoruz.
want to spread this to
Biz
some other
350 bin
regions in
Türk,
the north of
3
Syria.
milyon 650 bin Suriyeli kardeşine
We
son
have hosted
8,5 yıldır
3.6
kucak açan
million
bir
Syrian
ülkeyiz,
brothers and
bir milletiz.
sisters in the past
Artık bu
few years,
kardeşlerimizin
350,000 of which
vatan
are
hasretini
Kurdish.
adımları atmamız
We
gerekiyor.
must now take steps
Barış Pınarı
to ensure
Harekatı'nın
their
bir
return
diğer
to their
önemli
homeland.
hedefi
Another
işte
significant
bunu
goal of the
temin
Peace
etmektir.
Spring operation is to make this possible.
Harekatla güvenli hale getireceğimiz alana öncelikle
The area
1
that we
milyon
render safe,
akabinde
thanks to the
bir bu
operation,
kadar da
will be able
Suriyelinin
to
yerleşeceğine
receive 1
inanıyoruz.
million Syrians initially
Buna
and
dair
another
planlarımızı
1 million over
muhataplarımızla
time.
paylaştık.
We have shared our
İnşallah
plans
uluslararası
with
toplumun
our
da katkı ve
counterparts.
desteğiyle
With the
bu önemli
contribution
planı
and support of
hayata
the international
geçireceğiz.
community, hopefully we'll
Bu
be able
süreçte
to put this
Rus
plan
dostlarımızla beraber
into
çalışacak.
practice. We'll work with
Gönüllü
our
geri
Russian
dönüşleri kolaylaştıracak
friends and
projelere
will
imza
carry out
atacağız.
projects which will
Değerli arkadaşlar,
facilitate
bugün
voluntary
Sayın Putin'le
returns.
terörle mücadele, Suriye'nin
We
toprak
discussed
bütünlüğü
the fight against
ve
terror, the
siyasi
territorial
birliğinin
integrity of
sağlanmasıyla
Syria, and the political
mültecilerin
unity
geri dönüşü noktasında
and the return
tarihi
of
bir
refugees.
mutabakata
We have
imza
reached a historic
Bu muhtıraya
agreement.
göre Türkiye
According
ve
to
Rusya, Suriye
our agreements,
topraklarında
Turkey
ayrılıcı hiçbir
and
gündeme izin
Russia
vermeyecek.
will not allow any division
23
on
Ekim
Syrian
öğlen 12'den itibaren
territory.
150 saat içinde
Within 150 hours, YPG terrorists and their weapons will be taken out of the 30-kilometer wide zone, and their fortifications and infrastructure will be destroyed. By the end of 150 hours, in the west and east of the Peace Spring operation area, there will be a 10-kilometer deep Russian and Turkish patrols. At Tel Frat and Manbij, all YPG terrorists will be pushed out of this zone together with their weapons. Against terrorist infiltrations, the two countries will take necessary measures, and for the following and monitoring of the memorandum, a joint mechanism will be established. Turkey and Russia will maintain their efforts for a solution to the crisis in Syria. We have reached an agreement with my dear friend Putin, which will be helpful for the permanent stability and its eradication from terror, and it will start a new period. I hope our memorandum will be auspicious for our two countries and our brothers and sisters in Syria. We are a neighbor to Syria and a friend to its people. So peace, stability, and security in this country, we want these to prevail once again in this country and will continue making efforts for this goal. I would like to thank Mr. Putin for his hospitality, and I thank you for your attention.
Okay, so you got the idea from that news conference, which we've just replayed, the two presidents speaking there after their 5-6 hour discussions in Sochi, that Vladimir Putin talked very much about the political process of finding some sort of solution to the Syrian war and what role Russia will play as the Syrian regime's main backer. And then Recep Tayyip Erdoğan giving some of the substance to the military operation and that side of what will happen in the safe zone along the border between Turkey and Syria. And then just to the side of the two presidents, there was Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and his Turkish counterpart, Mevlut Çavuşoğlu. They spoke briefly, but they made a number of points that outlined the agreement that is the Memorandum of Understanding, as I've got it here in front of me, between Turkey and the Russian Federation, made in Sochi on October the 22nd, 2019. And then there was even more detail about what the two countries have agreed and how they're going to operate together, as well as separately, on the Turkish side of the border with Syria and also inside Syrian territory. So here are the two foreign ministers.
Will continue the political integrity, and they will provide national security in Turkey. Number two, they underline their decisions to fight terrorism in all its forms, and they will fight separatism on the territory of Syria. Three, within this context, status quo, the existing status quo in the peace spring with a depth up to 30 kilometers will be kept. Number four, both countries underline the importance of Adnan agreement, and they will keep applying that. Five, starting from 12:00, 23 October 2019, on the Syrian side of Turkish-Syrian border, the Russian police forces will enter the territory, and they will support. They will support during the actions around the 30 kilometers of the border. Starting from this moment, they will start joint monitoring from Turkish and Russian side from the territory of Peace Spring. 6. All the troops will be withdrawn. 7. Both sides will take necessary measures to fight terrorism. And 8. They will help refugees to return in a peaceful way. 9. They will create a monitoring and verification mechanism to monitor and coordinate this memorandum. 10. Both sides will continue working on the solutions and mechanisms of solutions of Syrian conflict, and will keep up working with the Constitutional Committee. Thank you very much.
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan and Russian Head of State Mr. Vladimir Putin have agreed on the topics underlined below. One, the two sides have agreed on the protection of the territorial integrity of Syria and the protection of the national security of Turkey. Two, terrorism with its all shapes and forms will be fought against, and the division efforts in Syria must be fought against. Three, at Tel Abyad and Ras Al Ain, a 32-kilometer deep Peace Spring operation status will be preserved. 4. The two sides underline the significance of the Adana Agreement. Russia facilitates the application of the Adana Agreement. 5. By 23rd of October 2019, Russian military police and Syrian border guard will operate in the Syrian side of the Turkey-Syria border outside the Peace Spring operation zone. They will remove to the 30-kilometer outside the zone. This will be completed within 150 hours, and by the same time, the current Peace Spring operation zones east and west, 10-kilometer deep, excluding Kamışlı, Turkish-Russian joint patrols will begin. 6. From Manbij and Tel Rifat, all YPG elements will be removed together with their weapons. 7. Both parties will try and prevent the infiltration of terrorist elements and will take necessary measures. 8. For a safe and voluntary return of refugees, a joint work will begin. 9. In order to follow and coordinate the application of this memorandum, a verification mechanism will be established. 10. In line with the Astana mechanism, the parties will, in order to find a permanent solution to the Syrian crisis, will maintain their work, and the Constitutional Committee's work will be supported.
Okay, so the details being given there by the foreign ministers of the two countries, Sergei Lavrov and Mevlut Cavusoglu. Where are the Americans? Where are the Americans? Courtney Keeley, at least, is in Washington for us. Courtney, what's the American reaction going to be? And obviously, we have to differentiate between potentially the reaction in the White House and the reaction from Congress.
And the Pentagon. It's quite chaotic here. Often the Department of Defense Secretary will speak after President Trump speaks, which isn't usually the norm. He's been trying to clarify troop withdrawal from Afghanistan. He's not really clarifying this right now. So the question is, as it ticks down to the U.S. Turkish agreement with only about 45 minutes left, what will the White House say? Now, they have said if Turkish troops have withdrawn and they're not conducting operations, that they will withdraw the sanctions, the executive order sanctions that came out of the White House, and they were already starting to do so. But meanwhile, you have congressmen and women furious at President Trump that he ever made a deal with Turkey, that he ever even actually, when this all started, seemed to green light Turkish operations. So that is a partisan political football being bounced around Washington. Secretary of State definitely speaks alongside the president. The last comments we had was very much conciliatory, that they want peace, that there could be military action. The big question mark is where are the U.S. troops left? What are they going to do? Because the ones that crossed over into Iraq has something to say whether they want them on their territory. And then this small group of troops that people are saying here in Washington, White House officials and others, saying might be around the oil fields in northern Syria. Are they still there is the question mark, and will they be crossing over soon? The last pictures we really saw of U.S. military crossing out were being pelted with tomatoes and a refuge as the Kurds protested them being left behind. A lot of military officials privately expressing a lot of grief over feeling like they betrayed their allies, so there's a lot of different messaging coming out here, and no clear message from the White House right now on this announcement between the Russians and Turkey.
Yeah, I mean, every single point you've made there pretty much is a military point. And so we'll wait to see exactly what happens. Some things are already clear, and they've happened as you were talking about those American troops withdrawing, being pelted with rotten fruit. We were showing those pictures. So that's all self-evident. But then there's the political fallout from all of it. And it seems as if the Americans have sidelined themselves, that it's of their own volition. And that's coming from one side of the debate, which I think is mainly from the White House, and the main backers of the president, who are his core circle. You've got the vice president, you've got the secretary of state. Let's see what Mark Esper says. You know, he's always being caught in the middle, it seems, confirming whether troops are coming, whether they're going, whether they're staying, what their purpose is, and all of that. But what about the political fallout here? Again, we've been talking about this for at least a week now, about how Trump is potentially going to get it in the neck again because of two leaders from Russia and Turkey standing in Sochi, shaking hands, and then explaining how they're going to control a certain part of northeastern Syria.
Right, and as you cut through the fog of war, I can't cut through the fog of D.C. except to tell you that President Trump does not speak in militaristic terms. He speaks broad terms, very exaggerated often, which often bedevil many administrators here, including the Pentagon, who speak military speak. It also bedevils international leaders because they don't really know what he means. What he really means is he wanted to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria. He wants to claim that as a victory. Are there any left? Does Mark Esper speak to the Pentagon, or does he speak to President Trump? Usually Mark Esper, Defense Secretary, doesn't actually speak until Trump clarifies his position. But because the way he speaks, the way he exaggerates, the way his time frame is off and off, we don't know when he does speak where we'll get any clarity. So you look to Secretary of State Pompeo. He is saying that this was President Trump's idea is to get out, that they're still making sure the oil fields are secure and they don't want ISIS to make any gains. But now with Russia and Turkey making these joint patrols, do the congressmen and women that are against Trump, mainly the Democrats especially, say that we've just basically handed over and ceded land to Russia, even though they refused to acknowledge in the last several days and weeks that Russia and Iran basically control most of Syria along with Bashar al-Assad. This is a small sliver of land that Turkey wants a security along its border, and the U.S. made it seem like it was a conflagration that was as large as the and now in the 9th year Syrian war. So it becomes down to these partisan political footballs here where Republican senators are incensed at President Trump's unilateral moves, but Senator Lindsey Graham is making some sort of move to tamp it down. And meanwhile, it's just the backdrop here of the impeachment inquiry, the backdrop of people wondering if President Trump has a grip on his own White House and his own, people question his mental stability during these times. So it's very hard because the messaging that comes out of the U.S., the way it used to, whether you liked it or not, whether it was hypocritical or not, there was a message. The only message I can tell you that comes from Trump, it'll be backed up by Pompeo and Esper and people like Mnuchin. That's his inner cadre of people, and what they're saying right now is they wanted the troops out of Syria. They've gotten the troops out of Syria. They don't want to be engaged in this. The last thing also that was sort of like a little branch, a little olive branch per se, was they just also announced today that they're giving over $4 million to the white helmets that rescue civilians during bombardments by the regime, the Syrian regime. So that was also a little sign amongst all this chaos. The U.S. is showing that they're trying to disengage, but also do the right thing.
Courtney, thank you so much. Our correspondent in Washington, Courtney Keeley. So let's speak to Obeid Hito, my colleague who is in Akçakle near the Turkey-Syria border. As we're coming to the end of the 5-day pause of Operation Peace Spring, we now have 39 minutes and 20 seconds. What's it looking like in terms of the agreement made between the Americans and the Turks that there would be this pause of 5 days? What's it looking at right now in terms of the YPG presence in the safe zone that Turkey wants?
Well, as of this morning in Ras Al Ain, there was still some sporadic gunfire. There were even reports of violations of the agreement by the YPG.